Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'll be your host for the next 60 guaranteed exciting minutes. I'm so glad you're able to join us. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. Seriously, I hope none of you have had the misfortune to miss Dominic Cummings giving evidence. I just want to share one item from the news with you, because I find this so extraordinarily accurate. This is what Dominic Cummings told the committee today, verbatim. He says, quotes, "The truth is, senior ministers, that includes the Prime Minister, by the way, senior officials, includes the head of the civil service, senior advisors, that means him, like me, fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has the right to expect in a crisis like this. When the public needed us most, we failed." They failed. Now, you already knew that, but that's the first time one of the, as it were, the guilty members has actually fessed up to the fact that they failed. I mean, just incredible stuff. So he is the veritable embodiment of the Petrie principle, where someone is promoted to a level of complete incompetence, and he's proved it dramatically. He's also insisting that the Prime Minister shares his position on the Petrie principle hierarchy. And he views the fact that the senior advisors and politicians were similarly incompetent. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight we're talking to Dr. Malcolm Petrie. Why? Because unlike the British government that scorns expert advice, here we like our experts. We like to talk to experts. We like to talk to people who actually know things instead of abusing experts. It's important, you know. People take a lot of time and effort and trouble to learn their subject. We should appreciate that. We should acknowledge that. It's important, hugely important. And I would suggest to you that Malcolm knows more than most about 20th century Scottish history and politics. And we'll be taking your questions live. So remember, The Nation Talks, TNT, so it's your show as much as anyone else's. If you have questions for Malcolm, let us know, and we'll try and answer as many as we possibly can. It's over to you. So, now to our guest. Tonight, The Nation talks to Dr. Malcolm Petrie. Malcolm, how are you coping with the pandemic?
It's been an odd one, I'll admit, John. Thanks for having me on. But I think I've kind of become a little bit inured to it, to be honest. It feels like it's simultaneously been not that long that we've been kind of been living this, but also that it's been years. So obviously I teach at a university, so we've been doing a lot of working from home and a lot of online teaching, which is a bit of a culture shock to begin with. But I think it's become strangely the kind of new normal. Certainly by the spring, it was just the kind of the way we were doing it. So some challenges working from home with a toddler in the house is kind of interesting at times, but I think it's kind of got there in the end. I think students have got used to being online. I guess we're hopeful given vaccines and things that we might get back to some kind of in-person. I think that's certainly the plan, that we'll be back in person for some teaching after the summer. But yeah, it's been a bit challenging. And I can't imagine how it's been for other people in much harder situations than my own.
Yeah, but it must be quite tough to, I mean, how do you teach on Zoom? I mean, you've got maybe, 10 or so people on the screen. I mean, how do you do that?
I mean, it's a lot like this, but with more people. In some ways, I think I'm relatively fortunate. I think I would say where I work, we have quite small groups. So I would normally teach maybe six to 8 students, which is just about manageable. You can kind of see all the faces without having to kind of scroll along. So yeah, it's been difficult, and I think obviously, well, as you'll know, being online is a kind of a strange experience. At first, it's a little bit like talking into the void. Sometimes, if you kind of hard to gauge body language, hard to gauge student responses, if they're kind of really listening. Although whether they were ever really listening when it was in person either, I guess, is an open question. But I think, yeah, they've kind of wrestled with it, and I think, maybe it's a kind of generational thing, but by and large, I think they're relatively comfortable with online, as long as they've got access to all the resources.
Yeah, I can see how that's important. Tell us a bit about yourself, Malcolm. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? How eventually did you become an academic?
So I've got this kind of, just think about this. I didn't realize it until I kind of thought about it, but that I am so kind of very much an East Coast person in terms of Scotland. I grew up in Aberdeenshire, so just south of Aberdeen, a place called Stonehaven, which I guess some people have kind of been to. Well, I guess maybe more so in the past. It used to be a sort of holiday seaside town back in the day, but less so when I was growing up there in the 80s and 90s. So yeah, I lived there all childhood, went to school there. I guess had a kind of relatively, I don't know, I suppose you maybe think about yourself a relatively normal, in inverted commas, kind of childhood. Sort of, I don't know, roughly kind of lower middle class, kind of just normality, small town Scotland. And from there went to university in Edinburgh. So give away how old I am, but 2000 I moved to Edinburgh to do my undergraduate. I started off, strangely enough, as but actually was a lawyer, but I did my undergraduate degree and a kind of professional postgrad thing afterwards in law. So I was kind of 5 years of law school, which was enough, I think, for me. So I kind of took a pause, worked in a bookshop for a couple of years, had a think about what to do. I think I always knew that I wanted to go back to university to do a postgrad, but I kind of was pretty certain it probably wasn't a law postgraduate. I mean, I think, as you kind of mentioned, I was always probably more interested in the politics and the constitution rather than the sort of more sort of narrower legal study and the kind of professional training to be a solicitor, which was kind of what I don't know, it's maybe changed, obviously, because we're talking like 2 decades ago, but it was much more geared to getting a job as a solicitor when I was doing training. I was a bit more interested in, I guess, the politics of it. So I went back to university after a few years out to St Andrews to do a master's in modern history, and then stayed there to do a PhD in Scottish political history in the 20th century. So I guess what would back in the 1960s, 1970s have been called labour history, but that's a term that's kind of dropped out of fashion. So it was more just kind of history of Scottish politics in the 1920s, 1930s. I get invited to things at work where they ask you to give career advice to current PhD students, which I was incredibly guilty and ashamed in doing so, because basically my PhD supervisor was a guy called Bill Knox, Dr. Bill Knox, who was a historian of 20th century, 19th, 20th century Scotland, and he retired just as I was finishing my PhD. So I basically got his job, so I don't ever really feel that I've got any great advice for current PhD students other than target a supervisor who's got one foot out the door and hope you get their job when they retire. So I did my PhD and I went back and worked at the university in Edinburgh for a year as a postdoctoral researcher, and then came back to St Andrews on a kind of lecturer's contract in 2016. So been there about 5 years-ish. Yeah, no.
Is there a big difference between universities like Edinburgh and St Andrews?
Largely an issue of scale, I guess. They're quite similar in terms of degree programs in the sense of traditional sort of Scottish universities, the 4-year arts degree. So you teach history students who'll be doing a mixture of other subjects as well in their first and second years. It's different, I guess, than the English system. But I mean, at St Andrews, like I said, we're in a relatively fortunate position. We're quite a small university in terms of overall student numbers of about 10,000, which is quite small these days, which then feeds through into smaller class sizes. So I'm always kind of conscious, speaking to colleagues at other universities, that don't want to mention, my kind of teaching load or my marking load to some other colleagues who I've just have it a little bit harder going.
Yeah. Being very topical, I see some of the Royals turned up at St Andrews today. Did you teach any Royals?
I didn't. That's just a bit before my time. I think I'd have to check. I think I'm about ages with the Duke of Cambridge. So I think I would have probably been doing my undergraduate at Edinburgh when he was at St Andrews. So we haven't crossed paths. And given, it's fortunate, but given the pandemic, I'm currently working from home, so I wasn't part of the welcome committee. Yeah.
We've had some questions. Normally I'll leave questions till later, but because so much has been happening today, Malcolm, it would be invidious that we just said, "Oh, let's leave that till later." John Paul Warrilow is asking, what do you reckon the chances are of a general election by the end of this year? And what do you reckon the chances are of criminal charges? I assume he's saying resulting from today's discourse.
So I guess we have to take them in order. On the general election, I mean, I think you feel now, I think, as we were speaking before we came on air, about how much has happened over the last six, 7 years, from the independence referendum down until now, really. I feel the need, I have to caveat everything with, kind of who knows what's going to happen, really. But I would be, I guess, surprised if there was a general election before the end of the year. I would be a lot less surprised if there was one next year. I think that's relatively plausible. If the UK government feels that there's been sufficient economic kind of, that awful phrase, but kind of bounce back or something, from COVID, that they may well feel, given the nature of opinion polling at the moment, that it's worth going back to the country next year. So a relatively short parliament. I'd be surprised this year. I guess the sort of proviso or the caveat to that would be, I suppose it may not be that much of a shock if there was a change of leadership, potentially. I wouldn't predict that there would be one, but I guess, after today, after countless days over the last few years, would I be surprised if Boris Johnson didn't see out a full term as Prime Minister? Would I be surprised if he stepped down at some point? Probably not. In which case, a new leader may well choose to kind of have an early election.
I think the odds on that are shortening by the day. I should imagine. Yeah. I imagine Mr. Gove will be sitting there on the side of the stage, waiting for the stage to be vacated.
And that was a name, I think, unless I missed it, was conspicuously absent from the blame list from Dominic Cummings' appearance, I think, wasn't it? Gove and Rishi Sunak were sort of exempted from a lot of the criticism that Cummings issued. So I think on those kind of issues, you might see a change of leadership. Maybe even then this year would be too soon. They may well wait till next spring or something for a general election. And sorry, the second one about criminal charges. I mean, it was raised today in committee, wasn't it, about manslaughter? And I suppose I don't want to kind of preempt any conversation we might have later. I would be surprised, I think. I suppose, another piece of news today was the collapse of the Hillsborough trials, wasn't it? So, I mean, I think those kinds of criminal charges or criminal kind of prosecutions are incredibly difficult to pursue. I would be astonished if members of the UK government found themselves in court for criminal charges relating to the pandemic. Whatever the kind of morality of it, I think, how can I phrase this? The UK government probably wouldn't be willing to see that eventuality happen.
Yeah. Well, okay, leaving those, taking that into account, what fallout do you think there might be Tina Chalmers is asking. Let's assume it's not political. Let's assume it's not any sort of legal. There are no major legal consequences. Do you think there might be some other form of fallout from this farrago?
I mean, I think for some individuals, I think there will be. I mean, it would be surprising if Matt Hancock, who was kind of an obvious target of Dominic Cummings at the committee, who kind of accused openly of sort of lying, not just to the public, but also to colleagues in cabinet, to the civil service. I suppose you would be surprised if that wasn't the end of his career at some point. Whether the Prime Minister would choose to get rid of him now, maybe not, but he's probably kind of finished. I think for some personal careers, it's probably there will be fallout in that regard. I mean, I think in a sort of strange sense, the Conservative government, the Johnson government, seems to be curiously sort of bulletproof or untouchable. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any consequences for anything, any kind of mismanagement, any kind of scandal. I mean, I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, so I grew up in the 90s with endless conservative scandals, around money or affairs or something. It seemed to be a kind of relentless sort of chipping away at the John Major government. Barely a week went by without some scandal. Those kinds of things that maybe in the past would have damaged a government back 20, 30 years ago don't seem to have the same impact anymore.
Why do you think that is?
I mean, I don't know if it's a kind of a cynicism with politics. I think that people expect that might be a post 2008, both in the sense of the financial crash, but also the expenses scandal. So there's a kind of lower barrier of expectations, for politicians and their behaviour. But I do think there is a kind of a hardening of politics in a lot of ways in the UK, a kind of firming up of divides. I don't really want to say polarisation because it's a kind of term that tends to get, it was bandied about with IndyRef, it was bandied about with Brexit. I'm not sure it's always helpful because it's normally used in a kind of very negative sense. But I do think maybe Brexit has kind of firmed up loyalties in some ways so that people are willing to overlook the behaviour of their own side a little bit. It seems to have got kind of disconnected from political allegiance or political loyalty. That's tied to parties in a different way. And the Conservatives, I guess, whatever your opinion is, I'm guessing on this platform there's not that many kind of Conservative supporters listening or watching, but they have responded to the aftermath of the 2016 referendum in the most kind of optimal way, I guess. Whatever you think of Brexit as an economic policy or kind of on moral, ethical grounds, just the electoral way in which they have managed to kind of reconstruct a big tent right-wing political alliance in England has been very successful. If you look at kind of vote share they're getting in England now, I think it's up in the high 40s. It's higher than Margaret Thatcher would have got in the mid 1980s in her pomp. So they have been very successful, and I think there's a sort of stronger identification in some ways, or an unwillingness to kind of accept that individual bad behaviour, criminal behaviour in some cases, indiscretions, should result in resignations in the way that they would have done in the past. I think
it's almost a bit like, looking at the way that President Trump behaved, sometimes appallingly badly. Well beyond the bounds of what most people would regard as being moral behaviour. Nonetheless, his supporters remained enthusiastic, not just complacent, but enthusiastic about his behaviour and excused it at every turn. Do you think we're seeing a version of that here?
I think there is a sense in which, if politics, and it is an if, I think, you could make an argument either way about this, but if it has become increasingly cynical. If electors have become increasingly cynical about politicians, then a figure like Trump in the US, but I guess Johnson performs a similar kind of role here. People don't expect any better. They think that all politicians are like that. But what figures like Trump and Johnson don't have is the kind of, again, this is not necessarily my own opinion, but they don't have the kind of condescension and the sanctimony that people dislike from politicians. So that although Trump, at least on paper, is a very, very rich man, Johnson is upper class by kind of background, education, schooling, that kind of stuff. Although socially they're from kind of higher, if that's the right word in this instance, I think people see them as somehow maybe more straightforward, more honest, in that they're not pretending to be better people than they are. There's none of the kind of patronizing sort of positioning that you get from some politicians who say one thing in public and do another in private. With certainly with Trump, but I guess Johnson in a kind of another way, it's kind of all up front. I guess would be the perception that they might be a liar and a thief or whatever else, but at least they're not pretending to be anything else. And there are liar and are thief.
Yeah. I think most people would agree with what you just said. I mean, it's unabashed. I mean, senior politicians now come on media and just lie straight to your face, and they do it without a tremor, a murmur, or a blush. They just do it.
I think it's not even that. Politicians have always lied. It's the kind of shamelessness of it, I think, that's maybe slightly different, or even more so the extent to which it's done kind of knowingly, like with sort of one wink to the audience, like, you kind of know I'm lying. The presenter of the interview knows I'm lying. I know I'm lying, but it's quite funny. Like there's that sort of level. You see it with people, not Johnson, Michael Goves, and like there's a sort of, it's not quite the right word, but a kind of impishness about it, that they kind of know that that they know that we all know that they're lying, but it's almost part of the act.
It seems very sad, it seems to me, because my sense of it is it diminishes society when that happens. I mean, I do accept your point about politicians and telling lies, but I think once it becomes endemic to the point that you just described, it must have an impact on the rest of society.
I think so, and I suppose the bit that I didn't say there, when I said that politicians always lied, I suppose they used to resign if they got caught. There was a penalty to it if it kind of came to light that you had been lying. I think with some of the particularly, and I get and given the impact of what happened in terms of the number of people that died during the COVID crisis, the kind of lies that Matt Hancock is being accused of are of a kind of different order than the kind of standard. I guess there's a sliding scale in politics about from a sort of election promise that you never intend to keep to to kind of outright kind of falsehoods, which are on critical matters. I think you're right. It does diminish, I guess, kind of political debate, and I suppose from the perspective where we're speaking, one, going back a little bit, one question about potential fallout from some of this. I do think it erodes trust in institutions, and in a Scottish context, probably hastens a process that's been underway, for at least a decade, if not more, whereby the Parliament at Holyrood has come to be seen in a kind of, I guess, as the best representative of the Scottish people, of Scottish political opinion, and Westminster has become, I guess, increasingly discredited. Not obviously, recent election results point this way, but not for everyone, but I think for a sizable proportion, perhaps a majority of the Scottish population, the focus of politics is now Holyrood, and that is seen as where kind of political legitimacy resides. And I think these kinds of events sort of feed that disillusionment with Westminster as an institution.
Do you think there might, taking on board what you've just said, do you think there might come some sort of challenge between legitimacy and power? I mean, for example, Tom MacArthur is asking, Malcolm, do you think that the Internal Market Bill will serve to make Holyrood like a council office?
So I think I understand the kind of terms of the question, or if I understand the terms of the question rightly, yeah, this desire to, I guess, sort of reclaim control over certain aspects that were devolved. I mean, I think I wouldn't necessarily go as far as saying it would turn Holyrood into a council. I think what we are seeing is a desire from the Westminster government, Conservative government, to kind of reassert, I guess, as they would see it, control and sovereignty and the sort of power of central government. I think there's probably, I don't necessarily move in elite enough circles to know for sure, but I sense that there's probably a kind of perception in Whitehall and Westminster that devolution was allowed to go too far, that the devolved parliaments have kind of slipped the leash a little bit, and that Westminster has to kind of demonstrate it remains the kind of the UK Parliament and not just an English Parliament with a few extra MPs, which I guess was one of the perceptions both in England, I think, and Scotland, so that come to pass. I mean, people scrolling through Twitter, looking at the news, I've certainly noticed that there's been some more adverts from the UK government about things like vaccine rollout, that kind of thing, armed forces, what they deliver at a UK level. So I think on a kind of public relations level, there's been a desire to reassert the sort of role of the UK government in Scotland. I think the Internal Market Bill is a kind of legal version of that. I suppose where I might, I guess, not defend the Internal Market Bill is not really my intention, but I think where there is a logic to what the government is saying about the Internal Market Bill is that devolution happened, in the 1990s, early 2000s, at a time when Brexit was unthinkable. So obviously written into the original devolution settlement was a kind of limit on what the Scottish Parliament could do, in that it could not, it had to adhere to European law. No legislation passed by the Scottish Parliament could be in contravention of European law. So European law constrained the Scottish Parliament, but also the UK Parliament. So there was a kind of, searching for the right metaphor, but a kind of guardrail or a safety net around the whole devolution settlement, in that whatever happened in terms of divergence, it was constrained by European law. So there was a limit to how much England and Scotland could diverge on certain, I guess, economic questions or commercial law, trading questions. Brexit obviously has kind of detonated that in a lot of ways, and so the kind of framework that underpinned devolution is disappearing, and the UK government clearly wants to replace it with European law being replaced with UK law as the constraint.
I think the question really is, though, is what happens when power turns out to be versus legitimacy? Because, as you said earlier, Scottish people, perhaps increasingly, regard the Holyrood Parliament as being a legitimate parliament for them. For good or ill, that's the view, and I think most of the polls would confirm that. But what happens if you have a legitimate body and all of a sudden another body decides to act other than the wishes of the legitimate entity? Where does that take you? Who wins in that? Is there a winner?
So yeah, I think this is the fundamental question that kind of sits in Scottish politics at the moment, and I think it's clearly being held up or delayed, I think, for understandable reasons, by the pandemic and a willingness, I think, by the SNP leadership to say, well, whatever we intend to do, it will wait until the kind of the pandemic or the recovery is underway, or the recovery's got, it's kind of vague phrasing at the moment, again, probably for understandable reasons. But there is a kind of fundamental issue here, like you say, between legitimacy and, I guess, between, I'm going to get trouble, I think, from some people in the question, in the comments from what I'm about to say, but the constitutional position, I think, is relatively clear cut. If you look at this pure, through a narrow legal lens, the UK Parliament is sovereign. But I don't think there's any, there's maybe a little bit of wriggle room at the edges, but basically the Scottish Parliament exists because the UK Parliament legislated for it. That's the kind of legal position. Obviously, there's a kind of political history of kind of devolution and opposition to Margaret Thatcher and the claim of right and the Constitutional Convention. There's a whole other story, but I think if you were putting on kind of narrow legal kind of framework on this, it's a creature of legislation, and the UK Parliament has the ability to legislate for Scotland. It can kind of play that sort of trump card of sovereignty over Holyrood if it chooses to do so. Notwithstanding that, though, I think there is the question of what that kind of legal position does when it runs up against, like you say, a kind of mandate, I guess. To take a phrase that was used in the 1980s a lot about the Margaret Thatcher governments, that they lacked a mandate to govern Scotland, that they might have a constitutional right to pass legislation, but they lacked kind of popular support for their programme. And we're heading back into that territory. The UK government can pass legislation, just as Margaret Thatcher could appoint Malcolm Rifkind as Secretary of State for Scotland when they only had 10 MPs. There was 60 odd other MPs in Scotland from all the other parties. You're heading towards, I mean, you want to kind of bandy about phrase, but that is a constitutional crisis, maybe not quite with a capital C yet, but that's a fundamental kind of clash of political legitimacy, like you say.
Isn't there an historical, looking back at previous secessionist moves and movements, take the American situation, a lot of the unhappiness in America came from an overreach by the British government because it desperately needed, on behalf of the East India Company, to flog tea to a bunch of people who weren't hugely fussed, but were fairly happy. And then it decided that there had to be taxes as well. It's not. There is a historical sense that perhaps when you get contention between two forms of legitimacy, one has to give way somewhere on the line. Would you agree with that?
So I don't think we're quite there yet, but you can see a path where we do end up there. That say like something like the Internal Market Bill, or perhaps other potential legislation, other moves by the UK government, which I don't think are beyond the realms of possibility, as they might see it, to kind of clip the wings of the Scottish government a little bit, maybe start legislating in devolved areas, or maybe, take some powers away from the Scottish government, that kind of thing. And they are talking about, certain pots of money that might be spent in Scotland, but that, wouldn't necessarily come to the Scottish government. They would be spent by the UK Parliament, even though they were in devolved areas. So you can see there might be a sort of an accumulation of issues whereby there's this kind of tension between the sort of, I guess, the competences of each Parliament, as it were. I mean, I think I would agree that if it gets to that stage of a standoff between a kind of on paper legal position where the UK Parliament is asserting its kind of sovereignty, and the Scottish Parliament is saying, well, actually, we have the popular mandate, we have the legitimacy from the people, we represent a kind of broader swathe of Scottish opinion than the UK government does, which is, maybe got a handful of MPs for Scottish seats. I think you're right. Somebody has to, in that situation, lose. Like, you can't. If it gets to that point, there has to be a loser, and somebody has to kind of walk away and accept that the other side is right. So, I mean, I guess the other way of putting the question, which might be slightly more controversial will be, what is the Scottish Government going to do if, or more likely when, the current Conservative government at a UK level refuses a second independence referendum?
It would be this. I think this is where it gets really interesting, and why I'm so pleased that you're able to join us tonight, because it seems to me, and several questioners are putting this point in different ways, which is looking back over history in the 20th century, the position that the Liberal Party took and the Labour Party took, we've ended up where we've ended up. And it would seem to me that if there is a situation where we've just talked about, where there is a challenge of legitimacy or authority or whatever terminology one cares to use, that this would probably place intolerable pressure on the Labour and Lib Dem members in the Scottish Parliament, because they would then have to choose between supporting the entity of which they're part or not. In other words, if it votes and they vote for a particular policy or perspective or point of view, I mean, I can't see the Conservatives joining in any of this, by the way, but if that were to be the case, wouldn't the effect of that be to the problem would manifest itself presumably greater there than anywhere else?
Yes, I mean, and I think you've seen some of that happen already. I mean, I think one of the under-examined or kind of underrated things that have happened in Scottish politics over the last 10, 15 years has been the kind of disappearance of the Liberal Democrats. In a lot, I think for obvious kind of historic reasons and kind of to do with the position of the party in Scotland, that Labour's difficulties have got the most kind of attention, coverage, and understandably so in a lot of ways. I think one of the reasons the SNP wins a majority in 2011 is because the Lib Dem vote falls off a cliff. Primarily, one would think because of the decision to enter coalition at Westminster in 2010 with the Conservatives. So that kind of older Liberal Democrat vote, members of my own family would have voted Lib Dem to kind of keep the Conservatives out in rural or kind of semi-rural seats. That vote kind of walks away. And I think that, if you look even at the kind of most recent election results, the Lib Dems win a handful of high-profile constituency seats, but I can't remember how many deposits they lost across, something like 50-something deposits across 70-odd seats. They don't exist as a political party really in what, 2/3 of Scotland. And the constituency seats they win, at least in Scottish parliamentary elections, they win on the basis of unionist tactical voting. Like I'm in North East Fife. It's Willie Rennie's seat, but that's a seat where you can kind of go and look at what happens over the last few elections and just see the Conservative vote disappear and the Lib Dem vote go up. So I mean, that has kind of happened in the sense that the Lib Dems survive as a vehicle for unionist tactical voting in parts of Scotland. Not much like Edinburgh Southern and the Labour Party. That is now a kind of unionist seat. Doesn't really matter what the particular party label of the person representing it is. So there's been this kind of, as the constitutional question has started to dominate Scottish politics, there's been this kind of process of sorting anyway, in which the Lib Dems have been the first to kind of almost vanish. They're now the fifth party. I think they kind of lose all kinds of privileges in terms of kind of First Minister's questions and committee representation. So they, are kind of vanished. And given that they were in what was the Scottish Executive, now the Scottish Government, in the first two devolved administrations, that's a pretty precipitous kind of decline for the Liberal Democrats in Scotland. And I think Labour is in the most difficult position of all in Scotland and Britain, I guess, because Labour is the party, I guess, that genuinely believes in Britain on some level. A version of, I guess it's become a bit of a sort of stereotype and a cliche, but that kind of 2012 Olympics opening ceremony version of Britain, you know, the NHS and kind of pulling together and a sort of social democratic Britain. I think David Edgerton on recently, you know, his kind of version of the British nation that emerges after the Second World War. I mean, that's a Labour creation, really, although it's administered by the Conservatives for some periods. Labour is much more uncomfortable with Englishness. You know, I mean, you can see how uncomfortable Labour politicians are when they're interviewed, particularly in the wake of the Hartlepool result and things. So that kind of shift that the Conservatives have proved, you know, whatever their kind of claims to the unionist label with a capital U, they're quite happy to be the English party. Quite happy to embrace, you know, that started under previous leaders, started in the wake of devolution, but Brexit hasn't kind of accelerated that process of the Conservatives becoming a party that represents England, and they can win elections purely on English votes. Labour can. So Labour has to find a way of kind of bridging that gap. It isn't clear to me that there is a way of bridging that gap as things stand. I think Labour has forgotten, in Scotland at least. You know, you mentioned the heritage and the position of, you know, while the Liberals in the 19th, early 20th century, Labour, once it overtakes the Liberals as the second party, that kind of position of home rule, all round Scottish home rule, a kind of radical tradition in Scotland, that there's a kind of longer term heritage that I think Labour needs to think about. But I think even if you looked at, say, the 1980s and the 1990s, the ease with which Labour figures, like, you know, when they're earlier in their career, people like Jack McConnell in the 1980s, you know, are happy to be in organisations like Scottish Labour Action, which is demanding, you know, a sort of firmer, more combative, more aggressive stance in favour of devolution. I think Labour's forgotten that in the 80s and most of the 90s, they were the Scottish party. They were the party that made the argument that the Conservative government had no mandate in Scotland. They were the party that said devolution had to be implemented to protect Scots from Conservative governments that they didn't vote for, and who were implementing policies that they didn't want. So in many ways, I think the SNP have taken a lot of the things that Labour used to talk about in the 80s and 90s and expressed them better, you know, since devolution. And clearly, I think since, you know, the Blair era, which I think discredited Labour in Scotland in various ways, which we'll talk about more if you want. But I think the SNP has become that kind of party that's willing to talk languages of mandates and kind of legitimacy. But Labour used to speak that language and to pretend. There's a tendency in the Scottish Labour Party now to go, oh, this is so unfair. We want to talk about education. We want to talk about health. And all, you know, the Conservatives on one side, the SNP on the other, all they want to talk about is a second referendum. But Labour used to be much happier talking about the Constitution, and they probably need to rediscover that ability to talk a kind of language of legitimacy.
Isn't that going to be very difficult now, though? I mean, it's almost like that ship has sailed. Let me explain what I mean. I watched a snatch of the First Minister's speech at Holyrood today, and she extended an olive branch to the other parties, hoping to work together across parties throughout the chamber. And then she made a specific reference to the Labour leader. And I thought, well, now there's a quandary for you, because if you do want to talk about education and you do want to talk about NHS, the First Minister has just said, I'd be happy to meet with you and talk about these things. What do you do then? You can't very well say, well, I'm not going to meet with you because of the Constitution, because all that does is drive people who are of that persuasion into the Unionist camp and to the Lib Dems. It doesn't do anything for you, for the Labour vote, I wouldn't imagine, unless I'm very much mistaken. What's your take on that?
I mean, I think the danger for the Labour Party, I mean, first of all, that's a good bit of politics from the First Minister, so, you know, sort of just needling that kind of discomfort of the Labour Party. But you can see that on a lot of issues, I mean, I think on some issues still, the Labour Party would be to the left of the SNP on certain issues, like say on social policy. And that there would be, if you could mute the kind of constitutional issues, that there would be some scope for Labour and the Greens and the SNP to do some kind of deals on certain issues to get kind of more radical, more progressive legislation through. But I think, I mean, I would probably agree with you. I think the constitutional issue just sits there in the middle of it all, preventing any moves towards kind of cooperation between parties that probably have more, terrible politicians, more in common than divides, like that sort of. But there would clearly be issues on like drug policy or something where you might get some kind of progressive policy out of Green Labour SNP cooperation.
Yeah, it just seemed to me that it put Labour in an invidious position, because here you are, you want to support your local hospital, you want to support your local school. Here's the First Minister of the country saying, I would like your help to do this. Do you then say, I scorn your help because of this thing called the Constitution? You surely don't. You surely say, well, I can't not talk. How do I avoid talking? And it becomes very difficult, particularly if the invitation is then repeated.
I mean, I think that Labour is in a very, very difficult position in Scotland, in the sense that probably, hard to be sure, like, and I'm not an opinion pollster, but I think that people who are sympathetic to Labour policy on, say, social and economic issues might have been, maybe more sympathetic to the Corbyn era Labour Party, maybe than the Starmer one, maybe a little bit more left-wing, more radical. They've probably already gone in the aftermath of 2014. So maybe some of those people who 10, 15, 20 years ago would have been Labour are now SNP.
Yeah.
And so does Labour try to win them back? Or does it try to hold on to what is probably now a much more small unionist centre-ish Labour Party membership than it would have been, because the kind of left and maybe the right phrase, like independent curious or a bit more open-minded on constitutional issues, have maybe already gone. So there's a kind of self-fulfilling element to this. If you look at the leadership election this year, when Anna Sauer was born, I think Monica Lennon, who had a different take on the Constitution, which is much more kind of agnostic stance, that the Scottish Parliament should have the right to call a referendum, even if Labour doesn't want one, it would recognise the Scottish Parliament has the right. She got about 40% of the vote, I think, didn't she, overall? So that probably tells you something about where the balance of opinion in the Labour Party is probably a little bit more unionist now. And I think probably the kind of fundamental emotion or position within the Labour Party is that they wish that question would go away. But it's a little bit like, I'll preface this by saying I'm not saying Scottish independence is like Brexit, but the way in which that issue operated in an English context presented similar problems for the Labour Party, because Labour was the only party that wanted or had to win both Brexit and Remain voters, and they couldn't eventually kind of square that circle. In a Scottish context, Labour is probably the only party that wants to win yes and no voters.
Yeah.
And whether that's possible, I'm not sure it is. And we would come back to the kind of the question that we always come back to in Scotland, which is federalism.
Yeah.
As this kind of get out clause for a party like Labour, to a lesser extent the Lib Dems, that this would solve all the problems.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question that I ask so many of our guests? I'm still waiting for an answer that I find convincing, and it's this. Having set you up here, Malcolm.
Yeah, I make no promises.
I do apologize. It's shameless. And the question is this. When I put it to particularly right-wing commentators, I say, the question is this: how come there's no right-wing nationalist party in Scotland?
Mm-hmm.
Their answer is, because the SNP is such a broad church. But that's that's a circular. I just said that. I thought, what's your take on that? I mean, why isn't there a very? I suppose there are a sprinkling of left-wing parties. You could maybe alibi, I suppose, nowadays, but there is no right-wing nationalist party. And if you look across most secessionist movements, there's a sizable right-wing view represented amongst them across the world.
So loath as I am to fall into the category of right-wing guests on this, I think that there's an element of truth to what they're saying. There are people in the SNP who I would place on the centre right of the political spectrum. You know, if you took them out, if they lived in Surrey or something, I think they would be conservatives. I think there are, and a reasonable number of them are relatively senior in the SNP. So I mean, I think there is some truth to that. I suppose it's a positive about the SNP in a lot of ways, and that one of the most striking things, certainly until Alex Salmond's intervention prior to this election, and the emergence of Albert, I think that the discipline of the SNP and the ability of the SNP to kind of manage the party and manage a kind of mass membership party as well, and a party that had a kind of substantial presence in 2 parliaments, you know, and I think that was one of the most striking. I mean, if you look at basically what happened to the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in England, which is to kind of revolt from below, you know, in both cases, kind of leaderships, traditions, cultures of deference, and kind of doing as the leadership told you, just gone. You know, backbench rebellions from left, from right, you know, from pro-Remain, pro-Brexit. We saw none of that in the SNP. You know, you look at all across Europe, traditional party structures are collapsing, new parties are emerging, and the SNP appeared to be able to kind of absorb all of that, soak it all up, you know, become a kind of 50% of the population party, mass membership party. I guess we're seeing signs that that's a difficult thing to manage over the longer term. You know, whether that's sustainable forever, I think is an open question. But I think I would suggest that yes, the weight of the SNP is on the centre left, and I think, and has been for a long time. Like, I'm, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that the centre right runs the SNP or anything. I think, you know, since the 80s, really, the SNP has been clearly a centre left party, social democratic. It's probably become a little bit more socialist even than social democratic since 2012, 2013, 2014. But that group within it that's much more centre right is still there. They haven't split off yet. But
there's no far right. I mean, if you look at secessionist movements across the world, they're generally characterized by a whole bunch of blood and soil nutters, to put it mildly.
Well, we have a different
jumped on the secessionist bandwagon early.
Tradition in Scotland, I guess, don't we? That, I mean, I go back, you know, so like I did my PhD on the 20s and 30s, and I think that there was always a question of why don't you get right-wing extremism in Scotland in the 1930s, right? Like, why, you know, you see it in other parts of Europe. And the answer is you do, but it tends to be loyalist in its leanings. Right, you know, so I think the kind of, I'm going to choose my words very carefully here. I don't want to kind of stray too much into controversy, but the kind of imagery and rhetoric that you might get around a right-wing or very right-wing national, I mean, there's some of it in Scotland. We shouldn't be, you know, we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much. I think there is some presence of that kind of more blood and soil kind of ethnic nationalism. It creeps in sometimes to Scottish political debate. But I think the kind of off-the-peg symbols that you might reach for if you were constructing a kind of right-wing political vehicle in Scotland wouldn't necessarily be those ones. They might come in a different set or slightly amended set of colours, or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a different tradition, a different culture.
Got it. That's the best answer we've had so far. I have to. I commend you. Say we've only got 5 minutes left, Malcolm. People who are watching and listening, how can they find out more about what you're doing? I gather you've got a book coming out soon. Could you talk about that and maybe the other stuff that you're involved in, that people, and how people might access what you're doing?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks very much. I mean, people can find me on Twitter. I'm also on the St Andrews University website. So I guess if you just Google my name, Mark Petrie, and St Andrews, it should take you to the page on the School of History where there's a list of things that I've done and things that I've written. Yeah, like I said, I wrote a book that was published a few years ago about politics in the 20s and 30s, largely about, I guess, the radical left in 1920s, 1930s Scotland. I'm currently finishing, my publisher's listening, yeah, I'm absolutely finishing a book on post-war Scottish politics, so between the Second World War and 1979, the kind of first failed devolution referendum, so that kind of post-war period. So I'm currently working on, I have promised to have that finished by the end of July, so that should be out next year with Edinburgh University Press. The other thing that I guess people watching and listening to this might be interested in is a project I'm involved with alongside Scott Haynes. He's a lecturer at Stirling University, so works on Scottish literature, but we're involved in a project looking at sort of political and cultural magazines in Scotland from the 1970s, 1980s. So there is a website. I think if you just, again, Google Scottish Magazines Network, you'll find the website there. There's a series of podcasts of interviews that have been done with kind of political, literary, cultural figures from the 70s, 80s, very much looking at the kind of creation, construction of kind of radical left-wing Scottish culture and kind of pro-devolutionary, pro-independence Scottish culture in the 70s and 80s. So there's interviews you can listen to, some resources that you can take advantage of. And I think some way further down the line, we'll be looking to get some of the original magazines digitized and available for people to look at. So it's something that might be of interest.
Yeah, sounds very interesting. Are there any messages you'd like to leave folks, the audience, with tonight? A couple of 3 bullet points, if I can press you.
In terms of the kind of political situation, I mean, I think the one thing I would stress, and I guess this would be my kind of historian speaking, is there's a lot of talk about how the Constitution has kind of come to dominate Scottish politics. I think my perspective would be it always has. You know, that the Scottish question has always been part of Scottish politics since, well, certainly since the kind of mass democracy, early 20th century, that there's always been a debate over Scotland's constitutional position and what Scotland's relationship with the rest of the UK should be. And different parties have adopted different stances on that at different times. So I think the idea that we're living through something completely different is misleading. I guess it's the presence of the SNP as a kind of major player that has kind of shifted the political debate. But I think that, yeah, treating with skepticism some of the claims that the arrival of the Constitution is something regrettable and new. It's just that the terms of the debate have changed.
Good. That's a terrific summary. Well, thank you very much indeed, Malcolm, for joining us this evening. It's been very enlightening and, if I dare say so, educational. Thank you for that. It's been really good. And thank you to all of you out there for watching us tonight. I know that you're all over the world and you're involved in different things at different time zones. We're very grateful to you for joining us this evening. As always, we have some great guests lined up for future shows, and you'll find all the details on the What's On guide at www.whatsonguide.scot. Go there, you'll find out who's on next. And I can tell you who's on next. Next week, we're back with a special guest, Scott Davis. Now, Scott is based in the Netherlands, and he'll be telling us what it's like to live and study there as a a proponent of independence. So join us next week. That's going to be interesting. And please, a reminder, look out for my Constitution column in the Sunday National. I know I always plug this, but it's definitely worth it. Not as worth as watching, reading Dr. Elliot Wilmer's stuff, but nonetheless, always, I suspect, I hope, an interesting read. And of course, this week I'll be dealing with the constitutional aspects of Boris and Dominic Cummings et al. And it may well be, by the time you read it on Sunday, it will be way out of date, but I'll try my best to keep it topical if I can. And if you like it, the Constitution column, tell the editor. And very importantly, please support Indie Live and Indie Live Radio. These are new voices for a new Scotland and for all the news that you're not getting. And right now, there's a fundraiser running on Indie Live. I do hope you get a chance to support it. And if you do, please take that chance, because these guys do a great job. And everything you're watching tonight, great guests like Malcolm, are only possible because of Indie Live and keeping that afloat. So if you like the TNT show, support Indie Live, please. Thanks again. A very good night to one and all. Join us next Wednesday. And always remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. Good night all. Take care.